welcome to American Catholic History, brought to you by the support of listeners like you. If you value this content, please become a supporter at americancatholichistory.org/support. I'm Noelle Heaster-Crow.
And I'm Tom Crow.
We're happy to get back to regular recording, finally.
Yes.
And we owe all the thanks to our supporters. Those who have stuck with us during our unplanned hiatus have been real heroes. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yes, we owe you a lot. These 10 months were a really rough stretch with my Montessori training taking up all of my time, but that is done. I have completed the coursework and I'm able to get back to other parts of life, like this podcast.
Yes, it was difficult to put all of this aside, but we are so happy to be back behind the microphones and sharing these stories. Also, we're back to planning pilgrimages. We may take a small group to Kentucky later this summer, like maybe 8 people. If you're interested, email us at feedback@americancatholichistory.org. But we're planning 2 pilgrimages for the summer of 2025. Definitely back to Kentucky then,
Yes.
and working on details for Wisconsin, but more details on both of those later this year.
Yeah, I cannot wait to get back on the road, sharing those experiences and praying together in those amazing places. So, but all that said, let's get to what we're really here for. I'm so excited. Dun, da, da. On with the show.
Today, we're talking about one of the greatest popular singers of the 20th century, Perry Como. Como isn't quite as widely known nowadays as his contemporaries Bing Crosby, Frank Sinatra, or Dean Martin. But then that isn't saying much. They were huge. But Como seemed to have something that none of the others had.
Yeah, he had the respect, the admiration, and the affection of everyone he worked with. And it seems that came from a certain poverty of spirit and humility that he possessed. And he got that from his parents and his hardscrabble upbringing.
Yes, he grew up in bleak circumstances, bleak being a word he used to describe them. But his parents' Catholic faith made a profound impact on his life.
It really did. No matter the success, millions of albums sold, Emmy Awards, throngs of fans, a long-running television presence, eventually 3 stars on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, he remained the same. Just one, for instance, of his simple approach. He never gave up his license to be a barber in Pennsylvania just in case the music business fell through.
Well, clearly that became unnecessary after a while, but after a certain period when he had enough money to live on for the rest of his life, hanging on to that license was more of a sentimental thing, a never forget your roots sort of thing.
Exactly.
So, let's start with his biography.
Sure. So Perry Como was born and raised in Canonsburg, Pennsylvania, about 12 miles southwest of Pittsburgh.
Hence the name, the Canonsburg Crooner, that he acquired later in life.
Right. He was born Pierino Ronald Como on May 18th, 1912, to Pietro and Lucia Como. He was the 7th of their 13 children, and he was the first one born in the United States. They had immigrated from the Abruzzi region of Italy in 1910. Pietro worked in the mills there in Canonsburg and raised the 13 kids while never making more than about $175 a month. But one thing he insisted upon was that his children took music lessons no matter how hard it was to pay for them.
Perry really took to those lessons. He learned many different instruments and was considered a very good trombone player as a teen. Ironically, the one instrument he never formally took lessons on, voice.
Right. Never a singing lesson.
When Perry was 10, he started working in a local barbershop to help support the family. He showed a desire to learn the trade, so the owner, Steve Fragipan, started to show Perry how to cut hair. Perry practiced on his dad and became good enough that when he was 13, Fragipan gave him his own chair. He was making about 50 cents per week.
The following year, 1926, his father helped him set up his own barbershop. Perry was just 14. But within a short time, he was sitting pretty, pulling in a whole $40 a week.
Now, that works out to an annual income of about $36,000 here in 2024. So that really wasn't bad for a teen.
Seriously. He was doing well enough that he was able to hire 2 other barbers to come work for him.
His parents were happy for his prosperity, and his father defined prosperity as enough to remind you to be thankful, which is a great definition.
Yes.
His mother predicted that he would eventually make as much as $60 a week.
Yeah, well, that's about $57,000 annually here in 2024. I'll bet plenty of teens would love to make that much right now.
I'd like to make that much.
Yeah, seriously, teaching and podcasting are great, but they're not often lucrative. Anyhow.
Well, yeah. Something else Perry was doing at this time was singing. He said, if things got slow, I'd pick up my guitar and sing. You put someone with Italian blood down in the bleak mine country, and his only defense against the bleakness is to sing.
And sing he did. He would sing while clipping hair, and his customers loved it. When a wedding approached, the groom and groomsmen would come in to receive every shampoo, trim, and shave service that Como could render. He'd deliver a repertoire of romantic numbers for those occasions. He came to be in such demand as the wedding barber that he took gigs as a barber in other shops, including up in Pittsburgh. His goal was to be the best barber between Canonsburg and Cleveland. And with his singing as an added bonus, he was well on his way to being the most successful.
His singing wasn't just about keeping his spirits up in spite of the bleakness, however. He once said the singing was a reflection of the joy that came from a happy home.
And that point is important because his family life really did make a difference in who he was. His parents were devout Catholics. They lived the faith in their home, and according to Como, all 13 children carried their Catholic faith with them throughout their lives.
This family faith became more evident to friends in the community in the late 1920s. His father, a man who had worked hard his whole life, who was vigorous and active, developed a debilitating heart condition. He was no longer able to work or do much of anything. He lived the last 15 years of his life in pain and very weak.
But Perry reported that his father remained happy, that those 15 years were actually the happiest years of his life. Friends from the steel mill and nearby mines would come to visit Pietro every night after work. Much of the time that they had previously spent going to the bar or some other haunt, they would rather spend gathered around Pietro. They were drawn by his joy and his acceptance of his suffering. Through him, many of them learned how to be joyful in spite of their bleak situations. They learned to take up their respective crosses and be better, holier men.
This witness had a profound impact on Perry. The lessons Perry learned from his close-knit Catholic family life and the poverty in which he grew up with would remain powerful forces throughout his life.
He learned the value of each dollar, and he also learned that family is more important than money. You can only wear one suit at a time, he quipped to an interviewer who asked why he passed up opportunities to make more money later in life.
When Perry was 20, he moved to Meadville, Pennsylvania, which is about 100 miles due north of Canonsburg, up toward Erie. His uncle had a barbershop there, where Perry quickly blew past all modest predictions of his mother. He was making $125 a week.
And that's just an astounding figure for the era.
Well, it's an astounding figure for this era, too. It's over $100,000 a year.
Yeah.
It's amazing. As a 20-year-old.
Yeah, seriously.
Jeez. But his fiancée, Roselle Beline, and a number of friends thought he should give another life a try.
Yeah, at some point in 1933, they drove the 90 miles to Cleveland where Freddie Carloni and his orchestra were playing. Carloni invited anyone who thought they had talent to come up and sing. Perry was terrified, but with the encouragement of Roselle and his friends, he went up. Well, Carloni was so impressed with Como's singing that he offered Perry a job on the spot.
Well, Perry wasn't sure. He just wanted to be a barber. So he went back to Canonsburg to talk to his father. His dad told him that if he didn't give it a shot, he'd never know if he could have made it as a singer. So even though the salary was a measly $28 a week, he took the gig. Perry and Roselle were married on July 31st, 1933. And 4 days later, Perry went on the road with Carloni and the orchestra, and Roselle went back to Canonsburg.
Como toured Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia with Carloni for 3 years. Roselle joined him for some of the traveling, but it was not the optimal life for a young couple. After 3 years, Como moved to the much larger Ted Weems Band and toured the nation with them for the rest of the 1930s. This period included Como's first experience on radio. The Weems Band had their own Chicago-based radio program, plus they got national exposure with regular appearances on The Jack Benny Show, as well as Fibber McGee and Molly, so Como's voice was getting out there. This continued until Roselle gave birth to their first child, Ronnie, in 1940.
And Perry was nearly fired when Ronnie was born. He was in the middle of a gig when he was told that Roselle was in labor. He left right then to be with her. He was nearly fired on the spot, but Weems relented and let the new father remain with the band.
Perry continued with the Weems Band for 2 more years, but in 1942, even though he was making $280 per week, that's more than $5,000 per week in 2024 dollars, he decided to quit the band and return to Canonsburg and to stable family life. He planned to go back to cutting hair, which he still loved to do, and he knew he could make enough money to be comfortable, that thing back to prosperity.
Right, well,
Yeah.
it's almost like he proved to himself and to his father that, yes, he could make it as a singer, but he preferred to be a barber with a stable home life with his wife and children.
So he began the process of opening up a new barbershop. He turned down a number of other music contracts, including one to be a Frank Sinatra impersonator. He intended to retain his own musical reputation. He also intended to pursue his dream of being the best darn barber between Canonsburg and Cleveland.
But then he got a call that grabbed his attention. An agent guaranteed him a radio program and recording contract that would allow him to stay in one place. No touring, no life on the road. The gig would require the family to move to New York City, but at least he would be able to go home to Roselle and Ronnie every night.
Roselle was all for it. She encouraged him, saying, "You can always get another barbershop if it doesn't work out."
Which was true enough. Seems to be like a theme throughout his life,
Yeah.
right? But Perry didn't jump at the opportunity. It took some more convincing by Roselle. Later in life, he quipped, "If it wasn't for her, I'd have had the best barbershop in town."
Wives, I tell you, you have a little bit of something to share with the world, and wives don't rest until you've gone out and become one of the most beloved singers in the world. Or, start a minorly successful podcast about American Catholic history.
Yes, wives are awesome like that.
Yeah, well, I won't argue with you
Yes. It's very smart. You're
About
finally learning.
about that anyway.
Yeah. I was going to say, you're learning.
Anyhow,
maybe,
so
but
Perry selflessly put aside, one more time, his dreams of hair-cutting glory, all to satisfy others' need to hear him sing.
it's very selfless.
Yes. The Comos moved to New York City, and Perry Como made his debut on CBS Radio on March 12, 1943. Shortly after, he got a gig at the famous Copacabana nightclub, and eventually he signed a recording contract with RCA Victor. They were looking for a crooner to compete with Sinatra and Crosby.
So, no pressure.
Yeah, really. What makes it interesting is that both Como and Sinatra used Bing Crosby, who was 9 years older than Como, as an inspiration and model for their musical careers or styles of singing.
Right. Well, also, Sinatra was 3 years younger than Como, but he burst on the scene in New York just before Como's big break.
Right. While Como took prodding and pushing from Roselle to become a singer, Sinatra had decided on his own from an early age to pursue a career in music. He was doing it his way, if you will. And Sinatra was forcing his way into the industry, performing as many as 45 times a week, singing 100 songs a day.
Yeah. Como, on the other hand, was just going along with what was given to him, hoping maybe to go back to cutting hair in Canonsburg at any time.
Well, it didn't happen. And time showed that signing the reluctant Como was a pretty good gamble on RCA Victor's part.
Also, while they were competitors, the three singers, Como, Sinatra, and Crosby, themselves clearly had no problem with one another. Sinatra even asked Como to sub for him at the Paramount Theater from time to time.
So in spite of his best efforts to be a barber in Canonsburg, Como became a New York City singing sensation almost overnight. In 1943, he was elected Crooner of the Year by one of the Teenage Swooners clubs, and his shows at the Paramount saw huge lines that wrapped around the block.
For his broadcast contract, he was with CBS until 1944, when he moved to NBC and the Chesterfield Supper Club. And then 4 years later, NBC simulcast the Chesterfield Supper Club radio program on television on Christmas Eve. His first televised supper club program marked the beginning of two things for Como. It was the beginning of 19 straight years of successful television programs, and it was the beginning of his annual Christmas specials, which ran until 1994.
So here was something that Como did earlier and better than any of his competitors. He mastered television. Bing and Frank both did cinema, and they did those really well. But they didn't make the transition to television. Dean Martin had a successful television program from 65 to 74, but Perry Como had already been killing it on TV for 17 years when Dean got started.
Right. Beginning in 1948, Como had a musical variety show on either CBS or NBC through 1967. He won 5 Emmy Awards out of 7 nominations and set the tone for other musical variety shows that followed. But the real strength of Perry's program was what happened off camera. Como was as laid back on set during rehearsals as he was in any other setting. Nervous guests became comfortable with him there.
Actually, one funny scene came up due to his Catholic faith. When his program aired on Sundays, it changed days during the week at different times, they'd have rehearsals on Saturday. Perry would often leave the set for about half an hour to get to confession. But to make sure he wasn't taking too much time away from the set, he would ask his music publisher, Mickey Glass, to go stand in the confession line for him. Glass was happy to, except that Glass was Jewish. He jokingly wondered what would happen if his turn came up and Como hadn't yet appeared. Apparently that uncomfortable situation never arose.
Yeah. Como's cool, calm, unruffled demeanor became his calling card. It came through in everything he did. His style of dress, cardigans, open neck shirts, and just more casual than dressed up was all part of it. Bing Crosby said that Como invented cool.
It's funny because Steubenville native Dean Martin is known as the king of cool.
It's true.
Yeah. And the way Martin sort of oozes through a song, martini in hand, he deserves the title. But Como was there first, just as laid back and cool as can be. In fact, Martin, who was 5 years younger than Como, used Como as a model for his own vocal styles. And if you listen to the two of them, you really can hear it.
Mm-hmm. No, you really can. But there was also a real difference between Como and Martin. Martin started out in slapstick comedy with Jerry Lewis and then later got into his singing, TV, and movie career. He really leaned into the suave, drunken playboy persona. But Martin in real life was really a pretty good family man. He wasn't the most devout Catholic, but he was often the first of his crowd to go home at night. He was actually a disciplined drinker and not an alcoholic. With Como, what you saw on the screen was who he was in real life, a friendly, laid-back everyman.
Everyone knew that the man you saw on the stage or on television or heard on the radio or the recording was just as laid back and easy to talk to in real life as he was in those performances. An interesting side note, we've talked about 4 of the biggest performers of the 20th century, Crosby, Como, Sinatra, and Martin. All 4 were Catholic, or at least all 4 were born and raised Catholic. I mean, they weren't all lifelong devout Catholics, but they all came from Catholic backgrounds. I'm not sure what that means or why it happened that way, but it's an interesting note.
Really is interesting. But yes, Como, though, he really was a devout, lifelong Catholic. He said later in life that he owed everything to his faith. In a 1953 article about his upbringing and faith, he wrote, "Everything that's ever happened to me has been the result of faith, the faith I found in my father's house and now find in my own house and in my world."
One of his favorite phrases was, "To this place God has brought me."
Well, considering how his singing career was really more out of obedience than design or burning desire, it's a good line for him to adopt.
Yeah, really. And he let this conviction animate his career. He insisted on family-friendly, comfortable environments in his television and live performances. He would never allow off-color jokes, and one time when a joke was misconstrued, he opened his following show apologizing for it.
He also wouldn't let his live performances become interrupted or marred by screaming girls. He would actually pause and explain that there's nothing to scream about. He did not want the environment that Sinatra and other crooners more or less encouraged.
But one thing he didn't do in his live performances was sing the Ave Maria. He had recorded Franz Schubert's Ave Maria in 1949 during a session recorded inside a Catholic church. He even asked his parish priest to be present to be sure he retained the proper reverential tone. This was more than just a song to him. He clearly saw it as a prayer.
It was one of the most requested songs at his live performances, but he would not do it. Though the Ave Maria was a featured piece on his annual Christmas specials, he did not believe a live performance was the right setting for that prayer.
Right. Performances were for entertainment.
His singing career resulted in more than 100 million records sold over a consistent career that spanned 5 decades. He had many, many hits reach the top of the charts, and eventually he earned 3 stars on Hollywood's Walk of Fame, one each for radio, television, and recording.
In his private life, he reflected the desire to just be a barber in Canonsburg. He kept his home life private and his wife and kids out of the spotlight. Even when he and Roselle went to Rome and had an audience with Pope Pius XII, he avoided publicity. He instructed his agent, his family, his recording company, etc., everyone, to keep the audience strictly private. He did not want pictures published. To his surprise and consternation, pictures did become public when the Vatican published them.
Yeah, the Pope was excited to meet Perry Como. Well, something similar happened when Perry and Roselle became a knight and lady of the Order of the Holy Sepulchre. They didn't make a big deal about it, but the fact became known about a year later when Fulton Sheen, who had been made a knight in the same ceremony, mentioned that fact to a reporter.
Just Fulton Sheen name dropping, yeah.
I know.
But this was who Perry Como was. He was a devout Catholic, devoted to his wife and 3 children, and that was that.
He also was devoted to service. In 1956, when he was in Washington, D.C. to accept a Personality of the Year award from the Variety Club of Washington, he was compelled to buy a new tuxedo. Before the dinner, he went to a hospital where he performed for polio patients. After singing, he sat down to speak with one particular 4-year-old boy, and he learned that the boy's family was very poor. That night at the dinner, he told the story of the boy and told the audience that he intended to auction off the new tuxedo he was wearing that night and give the proceeds to the boy's family. The tuxedo raised the equivalent of $29,000 right there.
That's just amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he never forgot his roots in Canonsburg. At some point at the height of his popularity, he convinced RCA Victor to open a record pressing factory in town, and he was always willing to help out local charitable needs, especially the Boys and Girls Clubs.
For their part, Canonsburgians,
Not sure.
Canonsburgites,
Could be.
whoever they are, they loved their favorite son. As early as 1946, 3rd Street, where Steve Frangipani's barbershop stood, was renamed Perry Como Avenue. Then in 1999, a life-size statue of Como was erected outside the city municipal building. On the base of that statue is etched that favorite phrase of Perry's, "To this place, God has brought me."
Just so fitting, all things considered, a real statement of faith. But neither Perry nor Roselle was able to be at the dedication of the statue. Roselle had died a year earlier, after 65 amazing years of marriage, and Perry himself was ailing. Perry Como lived only 3 years after Roselle's death. His death came peacefully in his sleep in May of 2001, just days before his 89th birthday.
The Comos had built a life together separate from Perry's success. They took 8 weeks of vacation every year, disconnected from the limelight and any publicity. Roselle and the children were never appendages to his success. The family was never in the tabloids, and Perry did not let the pursuit of more money or success harm his family life. Perry was reportedly a daily or nearly daily mass goer.
In 1953, he said, "I pray just like my kids do. Were my prayers ever answered? If you believe anything you think, do, or have is an answer to prayer, if you believe, you know that without anybody having to tell it to you, then your heart's at peace. If your heart's at peace, everything else is. If it isn't, everything else is wrong. That's just the way it always is."
After his death, Perry Como's funeral mass was at St. Edward Catholic Church in Palm Beach County, Florida. He was buried next to his loving wife, Roselle. Perry had recorded 40 albums, released 150 singles, and reached the height of fame and success. But he never lost sight of what was ultimately important. "To this place, God has brought me," he said. This has been American Catholic History. If you enjoy American Catholic history, please become a supporter. We've got great perks for supporters. Get information on how to become a supporter and the perks at americancatholichistory.org/support.
Also on our website, sign up for our newsletter, learn more about Perry Como, see about our pilgrimages, and find other great stories from American Catholic history.
We also love the great reviews our listeners leave. Those and the 5-star ratings help others find us. You can also email us feedback, questions, tips for episode topics, and other comments at feedback@americancatholichistory.org. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/American Catholic History, on Instagram at ACH_podcast, and follow us on Twitter at ACH1513. I suppose we should actually say X at ACH1513.
Yeah, really.
I'm Noelle Heaster-Crow.
And I'm Tom Crow.
Thank you once again for joining us on American Catholic History, made possible by listeners like you.